The Story Girl, Chapter 31, On the Edge of Light and Dark. We celebrated the November day when Peter was permitted to rejoin us by a picnic in the orchard. Sara Ray was also allowed to come, under protest, and her joy over being among us once more was almost pathetic. She and Cecily cried in one another's arms as if they had been parted for years. We had a beautiful day for our picnic. November dreamed that it was May. The air was soft and mellow with pale aerial mists in the valleys and over the leafless beeches on the western hill. The sere stubble fields brooded in glamour, and the sky was pearly blue. The leaves were still thick on the apple trees, though they were russet in hue. An aftergrowth of grass was richly green, unharmed as yet by the nipping frosts of the previous nights. The winds made a sweet, drowsy murmur in the boughs, as of bees among apple blossoms. "It's just like spring, isn't it?" said Felicity. The Story Girl shook her head. "No, not quite. It looks like spring, but it isn't spring. It's as if everything was resting, getting ready to sleep. The spring, they're getting ready to grow. Can't you feel the difference?" "I think it's just like spring," insisted Felicity. In the sun-sweet place before the pulpit stone, we boys had put up the board table, and Aunt Janet allowed us to cover it with an old tablecloth, the worn places in which the girls artfully concealed with frost-whitened ferns. We had the kitchen dishes, and the table was gaily decorated with Cecily's 3 scarlet geraniums and maple leaves in the cherry vase. As for the viands, they were fit for the gods on high Olympus. Felicity had spent the whole previous day and the forenoon of the picnic day in concocting them. Her crowning achievement was a rich little plum cake, on the white frosting of which the words "Welcome back" were lettered in pink candies. This was put before Peter at his place, and he was almost overcome. "To think that you go to such trouble for me," he said. "We ought to have grace," said Felicity, as we sat down at the festal board. "Will anyone say it?" She looked at me, but I blushed to the roots of my hair and shook my head sheepishly. An awkward pause ensued. It looked as if we would have to proceed without grace. Then Felix suddenly shut his eyes, bent his head, and said a very good grace without any appearance of embarrassment. We looked at him, when it was over, with an increase of respect. "Where on earth did you learn that, Felix?" I asked. "It's the grace Uncle Alex says at every meal," answered Felix. We felt rather ashamed of ourselves. Was it possible that we had paid so little attention to Uncle Alec's grace that we did not recognize it when we heard it on another's lips? "Now," said Felicity jubilantly, "let's eat everything up." In truth, it was a merry little feast. We had gone without our dinners in order to save our appetites, and we did ample justice to Felicity's good things. Patty sat on the pulpit stone and watched us with great yellow eyes, knowing that tidbits would come his way later. Many witty things were said, or at least we thought so, and uproarious was the laughter. Never had the old King orchard known a blither merrymaking of lighter hearts. The picnic over, we played games until the early falling dusk, and then we went with Uncle Alec to the back field to burn the potato stalks, the crowning delight of that day. The stalks were the heaps all over the field, and we were allowed the privilege of setting fire to them. 'Twas glorious. In a few minutes the field was alight with blazing bonfires, over which rolled great, pungent clouds of smoke. From piles to pile we ran, shrieking with delight, to poke each up with a long stick, and watch the gush of rose-red sparks stream off into the night. In what a whirl of smoke and firelight and wild, fantastic, hurling shadows we were! When we grew tired of our sport, we went to the windward side of the field and perched ourselves on the high pole fence that skirted a dark spruce wood, full of strange, furtive sounds. Over us was a great dark sky, blossoming with silver stars, and all around lay dusky, mysterious reaches of meadows and wood in the soft, empurpled night. Away to the east, a shimmering silveriness beneath a palace of aerial clouds foretokened moonrise. But directly before us, the potato field, with its writhing smoke and sullen flames and gigantic shadow of Uncle Alec crossing and recrossing it, reminded us of Peter's famous description of the bad place, and probably suggested to the story girl's remark. "I know a story," she said, infusing just the right shade of weirdness in her voice, "about a man who saw the devil. Now what's the matter, Felicity?" "I can never get used to the light way you mention that name," complained Felicity. "To hear you speak of the old Scratch, any one would think he was just a common person." "Never mind, tell us the story," I said curiously. "It is about Mrs. John Martin's uncle at Markdale," said the story girl. "I heard Uncle Roger tell it the other night. He didn't know that I was listening in the cellar hatch outside the window, or I don't suppose he would have told it. Mrs. Martin's uncle's name was William Cowan, and he had been dead for 20 years, but 60 years ago was a young man, and a very wild, wicked young man. He did everything bad he could think of, and he never went to church, and he laughed at everything religious, even the devil. He didn't believe there was a devil at all. One beautiful summer Sunday evening his mother pleaded with him to go to church with her, but he would not. He told her that he was going fishing instead, and when church time came he swaggered past the church with his fishing rod over his shoulder, singing a godless song. Halfway between the church and the harbor there was a thick spruce wood, and the path ran through it. When William Cowan was halfway through it, something came out of the wood and walked beside him. I have never heard anything more horrible suggested than that innocent word, something, as enunciated by the story girl. I felt Cecily's hand, icy cold, clutch mine. What was it like?" whispered Felix, curiosity getting the better of his terror. "It was tall and black and hairy," said the story girl. Her eyes glowed with uncanny intensity in the red glare of the fires. "It lifted one great hairy hand with claws on the end of it and clasped William Cowan, first one on shoulder and then on the others, and said, 'Good sport, you brother.' William Cowan gave a horrible scream and fell on his face right there in the wood. Some of the men around the church door heard the scream, and they rushed down to the wood. They saw nothing but William Cowan laying like a dead man on the path. They took him up and carried him home, and when they undressed him to put him to bed, there on each shoulder was the mark of a big hand burned into the flesh. It was a week before the burns healed, and the scars never went away. Always, as long as William Cowan lived, he carried on his shoulders the prints of the devil's hand. I really do not know how we should ever have got home, but we left on our own devices. We were cold with fright. How could we turn our backs on the eerie spruce wood, out of which something might pop out at any moment? How cross those long, shadowy fields between us and our roof tree? How venture through the darkly mysterious bracken hollow? Fortunately, Uncle Alec came along at that crisis and said he thought we'd better come home now, since the fires were nearly out. We slid down from the fence and started, taking care to keep close together and in front of Uncle Alec. "I don't believe a word of that yarn," said Dan, trying to speak with his usual incredulity. "I don't see how you can help believing it," said Cecily. "It isn't as if it was something we'd read of, or that happened far away. It happened just down here in Markdale, and I've seen that very spruce wood myself." "Oh, I suppose William Cowan got a fright of some kind," conceded Dan, "but I don't believe he saw the devil." Old Mr. Morrison at Lower Markdale was one of the men who undressed him, and he remembers seeing the marks," said the Story Girl triumphantly. "How did William Cohen behave afterwards?" I asked. "He was a changed man," said the Story Girl. "Too much changed. He never was known to laugh again, and even smile. He became a very religious man, which was a good thing, but he was dreadfully gloomy, and thought everything pleasant sinful. He wouldn't even eat any more than was actually necessary to keep him alive. Uncle Roger says if he had been a Roman Catholic he would have become a monk, but as he was a Presbyterian, all he could do was to turn into a crank." "Yes, but your Uncle Roger was never clapped on the shoulder and called brother by the devil," said Peter. "If he had, he mightn't have been so precocious and jolly afterwards himself." "I do wish to goodness," said Felicity in exasperation, "that you'd stop talking of of such subjects in the dark. I'm so scared now that I keep thinking Father's steps behind us are somethings. Just think, my own father." The Story Girl slipped her arm through Felicity's. "Never mind," she said soothingly. "I'll tell you another story, such a beautiful story that you'll forget all about the devil." She told us one of Hans Andersen's most exquisite tales, and the magic of her voice charmed away all the fears, so that when we reached the Bracken Hollow, a lake of shadow surrounded by the silvery shore of moonlight fields, we went through it without a thought, and beyond us on the hill the homelight was glowing from the farms, windowed like a beacon of old loves. Chapter 32. The Opening of the Blue Chest. November wakened from her dream of May in a bad temper. The day after the picnic a cold autumn rain set in, and we got up to find our world a drench, wind-writhen place, with shodden fields and dour skies. The rain was weeping on the roof, as if it were shedding the tears of old sorrows. The willow by the gate tossed its gaunt branches wildly, as if it were some passionate spectacle thing, wringing its fleshless hands in agony. The orchard was haggard and uncomely. Nothing seemed the same except the staunch, trusty old spruces. It was Friday, but we were not to begin going to school again until Monday, so we spent the day in the granary, sorting apples and hearing tales. In the evening the rain ceased, and the wind came round on the northwest, freezing suddenly, and the chilly yellow sunset beyond the dark hills seemed to herald a brighter morrow. Felicity and the Story Girl and I walked down to the post office for the mail. Along the road where fallen leaves went ebbing fitfully up and down before us in weird, uncanny dances of their own. The evening was full of eerie sounds, the creaking of fir boughs, the whistle of the wind in the tree-tops, the vibration of strips of dried bark on the rail fences. But we carried summer and sunshine in our hearts, and the bleak unloveliness of the outer world only intensified our inner radiance. Felicity wore her new velvet hood with a coquettish little collar of white fur about her neck. Her golden curls framed her lovely face, and the wind stung the pink of her cheeks in crimson. On my left hand walked the Story Girl, her red cap on her jaunty brown head. She scattered her words along the path like the pearls and diamonds of the old fairy tale. There was one of Father's thin letters for Felix, a fat foreign letter for the Story Girl, addressed to her father's minute handwriting, a drop letter for Cecily from some school friend, with "in haste" written across the corner, and a letter for Aunt Janet, postmarked Montreal. "I can't think who that is from," said Felicity. "Nobody in Montreal ever writes to Mother. Cecily's letter is from M. Fruin. She always puts 'in haste' on the letter, no matter what's in them." When we reached home, Aunt Janet opened and read her Montreal letter, and then she laid it down and looked about her in astonishment. "Well, did you ever?" she said. "What in the world is the matter?" said Uncle Alec. "This letter is from James Ward's wife in Montreal," said Aunt Janet solemnly. "Rachel Ward is dead, and she told James' wife to write me and tell me to open the old blue chest." "Hurrah!" shouted Dan. "Donald King," said his mother severely, "Rachel Ward was your relative, and she's dead. What do you mean by such behavior?" "I never was acquainted with her," said Dan sulkily, "and I wasn't hurrahing because she's dead. I was hurrahing because the blue chest is to be opened at last." "So poor Rachel is gone," said Uncle Alec. "She must have been an old woman, 75, I suppose. I remember her as a fine blooming young woman. Well, well, and so the old chest is to be opened at last. What is to be done with its contents?" "Rachel left instructions about them," answered Aunt Janet, referring to the letter. "The wedding dress and veil and letters are to be burned. There are 2 jugs in which are to be sent to James's wife. The rest of the things are to be given around among the connection. Each member is to have one to remember her by." "Oh, can't we open it right away, this very night?" asked Felicity eagerly. "No, indeed," said Aunt Janet, folding up the letter decidedly. "That chest has been locked up for 50 years, and it'll stand being locked up one more night. You children wouldn't sleep a wink tonight if we opened it now. You'd go wild with excitement." "I'm sure I won't sleep anyhow," said Felicity. "Well, at least you'll open it the first thing in the morning, won't you, Ma?" "No, I'll do nothing of the sort," said Aunt Janet. "I want to get the work out of the way first, and Roger and Olivia will want to be here too. We'll say 10 o'clock tomorrow afternoon." "That's 16 whole hours yet," sighed Felicity. "I'm going right over to tell the Story Girl," said Cecily. "Won't she be excited?" We were all excited. We spent the evening speculating on the possible content of the chest. Cecily dreamed miserably that night that the moths had eaten everything in it. The morning dawned on a beautiful world. A very slight fall of snow had come in the night, just enough to look like a filmy veil of lace flung over the dark evergreens and the hard frozen ground. A new blossom time seemed to have revisited the orchard. The spruce wood behind the house appeared to be woven out of enchantment. There is nothing more beautiful than a thickly growing wood of firs, lightly powdered with new fallen snow. As the sun remained hidden by the gray clouds, this fairy beauty lasted all day. The Story Girl came over early in the morning, and Sara Ray, to whom faithful Cecily had sent word, was also in hand. Felicity did not approve of this. "Sara Ray isn't any relation of our family," she scolded to Cecily, "and so she has no right to be present." "She's a particular friend of mine," said Cecily with dignity. "We have her in everything, and it wouldn't hurt her feelings dreadfully to be left out of it now. Peter is no relation either, but he is going to be here when we open it, so why shouldn't Sara?" "Peter ain't a member of the family yet, but maybe he will be some day. Hey, Felicity?" said Dan. "You're awful smart, aren't you, Dan King?" said Felicity, reddening. "Perhaps you'd like to send for Kitty Marr, too, though she don't laugh at your big mouth." "It seems as if 10 o'clock would never come," sighed the Story Girl. "The work is all done, and Aunt Olivia and Uncle Roger are here, and the chest might just as well be opened right away." "Mother said 10 o'clock, and she'll stick to it," said Felicity crossly. "It's only 9 now." "Let's put the clock on half an hour," said the Story Girl. "The clock in the hall isn't going, so no one will know the difference." We all looked at each other. "I wouldn't dare," said Felicity. "Oh, if that's all, I'll do it," said the Story Girl. When 10 o'clock struck, Aunt Janet came into the kitchen, remarking innocently that it hadn't seemed any time since 9. We must have looked horribly guilty, but none of the grown-ups suspected anything. Uncle Alec brought the axe and pried off the cover of the old blue chest while everybody stood around in silence. Then came the unpacking. It was certainly an interesting performance. Aunt Janet and Aunt Olivia took everything out and laid it on the kitchen table. We children were forbidden to touch anything, but fortunately we were not forbidden to use our eyes and tongues. "There are the pink and gold vases Grandmother King gave her," said Felicity, as Aunt Olivia unwrapped them, their tissue paper swathing a pair of slender, old-fashioned, twisted vases of pink glass, over which little golden leaves were scattered. "Aren't they handsome?" "And oh," exclaimed Cecily in delight, "there's the china fruit basket with apples on the handle. Doesn't it look real?" "I've thought so much about it. Oh, Mother, please, let me hold it for a minute. I'll be careful." "There comes the china set Grandfather King gave her," said the Story Girl wistfully. "Oh, it makes me feel sad. Think of all the hopes that Rachel Ward must have put away in that chest with all her pretty things." Following these came a quaint little candlestick of blue china and the 2 jugs which were to be sent to James's wife. "They are handsome," said Aunt Janet rather enviously. "They must be 100 years old. Aunt Sarah Ward gave them to Rachel, and she had them for at least 50 years. I should have thought one would have been enough for James's wife, but of course we must do just as Rachel wishes. I declare, here's a dozen tin patty pans." "Tin patty pans aren't very romantic," said the Story Girl discontentedly. "I notice that you're as fond as anyone of what is baked in them," said Aunt Janet. "I've heard of those patty pans. An old servant Grandmother King had them gave them to Rachel. Now we were coming to the linen. That was Uncle Edward Ward's present. How yellow it has gone." We children were not greatly interested in the sheets and tablecloths and pillowcases, which now came out of the capacious depths of the old blue chest, but Aunt Olivia was quite enraptured over them. "What sewing!" she said. "Look, Janet. You'd almost need a magnifying glass to see those stitches. Look at the initial on the corner of each. Rachel learned that stitch from the nuns in Montreal. It looks as if it was woven into the material." "Here are her quilts," said Aunt Olivia. "Yes, there's the blue and white counterpane Aunt Grandmother Ward gave her, and the rising sun quilt her Aunt Nancy made for her, and the braided ring. The colors are not faded one bit. I want that rug, Janet." Underneath the linen was Rachel Ward's wedding clothes. The excitement of the girls waxed red-hot over these. There was a Paisley shawl, and the wrappings of which it had come from the store, and a wide scarf of some yellowed lace. There was the embroidered petticoat, which had cost Felicity such painful blushes, and a dozen beautifully worked sets of fine muslin under sleeves, which had been the fashion of Rachel Ward's youth. "This was to have been her appearing out dress," said Aunt Olivia, lifting out a shot green silk. "It is all cut to pieces, but what a pretty soft shade it was. Look at the skirt, Janet. How many yards must it measure around?" "Hoop skirts were in then," said Aunt Janet. "I don't see her wedding hat here." "I was always told that she packed it away, too." "So was I, but she couldn't have. I certainly don't see it here. I have heard that the white plume on it cost a small fortune. Here's her black silk mantle. It seems like a sacrilege to meddle with these clothes." "Don't be foolish, Olivia. They must be unpacked at least, and they must all be burned since they have cut so badly. The purple cloth dress is quite good, however. It can be made over nicely, and it would become you very well, Olivia." "No, thank you," said Aunt Olivia with a little shudder. "I should feel like a ghost. Make it over for yourself, Janet." "Well, I will, if you don't want it. I'm not troubled with fancies. That seems to be all except this box. I suppose the wedding dress is in it." "Oh," breathed the girls, crowding about Aunt Olivia. as she lifted the box and cut the cords round it. Inside was laying a dress of soft silk that had once been white, but was now yellowed with age, and enfolded it like a mist, a long white bridal veil, radiant with small, strange, old-time perfume that came wafting up in sweetness. "Poor Rachel Ward," said Aunt Olivia softly. "Here's her point lace handkerchief. She made it herself. It is like a spider's web. Here are the letters Will Montague wrote on it. And here," she added, "take up a crimson velvet case with a tarnished gilt clasp, are their photographs, his and hers." We looked eagerly at the daguerreotypes in the old case. "Why, Rachel Ward wasn't a bit pretty!" exclaimed the Story Girl, in poignant disappointment. No, Rachel Ward was not pretty. That had to be admitted. The picture showed a fresh young face with strongly marked irregular features, large black eyes, and black curls hanging round the shoulders in old-time style. "Rachel wasn't pretty," said Uncle Alec, "but she had a lovely color and a beautiful smile. She looks far too sober in that picture." "A handsome rogue," growled Uncle Alec. "I never liked that man, Will Montague. I was only a little chap of 10, but I saw through him. Rachel Ward was far too good for him." We would dearly have liked to get a peep into the letters, too, but Aunt Olivia would not allow that. They must be burned unread, she declared. She took the wedding dress and veil, the picture case, and the letters away with her. The rest of the things were put into the chest, pending their ultimate distribution. Aunt Janet gave each of us boys a handkerchief, and the Story Girl got the blue candlesticks. Felicity and Cecily each got a pink and gold vase. Even Sara Ray was made happy by the gift of a little china plate, with a loudly colored picture of Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh in the middle of it. Moses wore a scarlet cloak, while Aaron disported himself in bright blue. Pharaoh arrayed himself in yellow. The plate had a scalloped border with a wreath of green leaves round it. "I shall never use it to eat off of," said Sara rapturously. "I'll put it up on the parlor mantelpiece." "I don't see much use in having a plate just for ornament," said Felicity. "It's nice to have something interesting to look at," retorted Sara, who felt that the soul must have food as well as the body. "I'm going to get a candle for my candlestick, and use it every night to go to bed with," said the Story Girl. "I'll never light it without thinking of poor Rachel Ward, but I do wish she had been pretty." "Well," said Felicity with a glance at the clock, "it's all over, and it has been very interesting, but that clock has to be put back to the right time sometime through the day. I don't want bedtime coming a whole half hour before it ought to." In the afternoon, when Aunt Janet was over at Uncle Roger's seeing him and Aunt Olivia off to town, the clock was righted. The Story Girl and Peter came over to stay all night with us, and we made taffy in the kitchen, which the grown-ups kindly gave over to us for that purpose. "Of course it was very interesting to see the old chest unpacked," said the Story Girl, as she stirred the contents of the saucepan vigorously. "But now that it's over, I believe I'm sorry that it was opened. It isn't mysterious any longer. We know all about it now, and we can never imagine what things are in it any more." "It's better to know than to imagine," said Felicity. "Oh, no, it isn't," said the Story Girl quickly. "When you know things, you have to go by facts. But when you just dream about the things, there's nothing to hold you down. You're letting the taffy scorch, and that's a fact you'd better go by," said Felicity, sniffing. "Haven't you got a nose?" When we went to bed that wonderful white enchantress, the moon, was making an elf land of the snow mist round outside. From where I lay, I could see the sharp tops of the spruces against the silvery sky. The frost was abroad, and the winds were still, and the land lay in glamour. Across the hall, the story girl was telling Felicity and Cecily one of her many tales. Our summer was over. It had been a beautiful one. We had known the sweetness of common joys, the delight of dawns, the dream and glamour of noontides, the long, purple peace of carefree nights. We had had the pleasure of birdsong, of silver rain on greening fields, of storm among the trees, of blossoming meadows, of converse and whispering leaves. We had had brotherhood, with wind and star, with books and tales, and hearth fires of autumn. Ours had been the little, loving tasks of every day, blithe companionship, shared thoughts, and adventuring. Rich were we in the memory of those opulent months that had gone from us. Rich then, we then knew our suspected, and before us was the dream of spring. It always safe to dream of spring, for it is sure to come, and it is to be not just as we have pictured it. It will be infinitely sweeter. The end. I hope you enjoyed this story. I enjoyed it. I'm not going to have a show this week, so I'm just going to tell you now what the next book is going to be. It's called The Little Flowers of St. Francis, and it's about the true story and real life of Francis Assisi. And that's up next. Join me for that, and thanks for listening.